Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session titled Using Psychometric Approaches to Improve Test Development. My name is Bo Bashkov, and I'm a measurement scientist at the American Board of Internal Medicine. I have several great colleagues who will also be presenting in this session. And then we have Kurt Geisinger, our discussant. So the theme of the conference is making measurement matter, and we can't think of a way for measurement to matter without quality assessments. And over the last few decades, we've seen great strides of improvement in psychometric theory. And only recently, we've seen greater recognition for the fact that the quality of assessments is largely driven by the quality of test items. So our focus today is on test development and using new psychometric approaches to improve test development. Without further ado, we'll start with our first presenter. Before that, I just want to say that you're free to ask your questions in the chat, and we'll address them as we can with a little delay for if they're directed to the presenter, as it's a little overwhelming to also look at the chat and present. But we'll have your questions answered. I encourage you to ask clarifying or larger discussion questions throughout the session in the chat. You're also free to ask a clarifying question after each presenter coming off mute or in the chat. But time permitting, we'll have a time for Q&A at the end after Kurt's remarks. With that, we'll start with our first presentation. And that will be Pamela Kaliski. Let me just stop sharing.
Okay, great. Let me get everything pulled up and we'll get started. Okay. All right. Are you all seeing my slides? Bo, can you give me a thumbs up? We're good? All right, awesome. Let's get started. Thank you all for coming to our virtual presentation today. My name is Pamela Kaliski. I'm a senior measurement scientist at the American Board of Internal Medicine. The title of my talk today is One Blueprint Fits All, Using Person-Centered Approaches in Practice Analysis Studies. And I'd like to give a shout out to my co-authors, Kelly Ruley and Jerome Klauser, both of whom have given a lot of excellent feedback along the way. So the illustration I'm going to provide in the study is within a credentialing exam context. So to kick things off, I'd like to just specifically talk about what credentialing exams are, why people sit for them. So when someone is sitting for a credentialing exam, the purpose is typically to obtain some sort of credential, usually to perform some sort of job. So for example, obtaining a license to practice law, or obtaining a certification in accounting, or maintaining your board certification in some sort of medical specialty, such as internal medicine. But before any high quality credentialing exam is ready to be administered, ideally there's other important test development steps that are happening first. So I'll briefly touch on these, and I realize this is a great simplification of test development. There's a lot of more complex process in place, but we will just briefly touch on a couple of high level important phases, starting with practice analysis. So a practice analysis study, this is when data is collected that determines what someone should be able to do in order to do that job successfully. So this is important because in order to ensure that the exam is serving the purpose it's intending to serve and it's appropriate for then awarding that credential, it's important to know what's actually happening on the job and in practice. And so that way test developers can design the exam accordingly. So in other words, these practice analysis studies are essential for our validity arguments for credentialing exams. There's a lot of practice analysis methods out there, lots of literature on all these. The recommendation is to find one that really aligns with the purpose of your assessments. 3 that you hear about a lot in the credentialing context are task inventory method, the critical incident technique, and professional practice model. Now, upon completion of your practice analysis study, you should have data available to you at that point that can then inform what topics should be on the exam and how much of each topic. So that's the type of information that ends up showing up on your exam blueprints. So you directly want your practice analysis results to inform your exam blueprints. These blueprints are a super critical component in having our rigorous high quality assessments developed. So when we can have data that sort of grounds the basis for developing that exam blueprint, that's ideal. So coming from the practice analysis, we would know what topics should be on the exam and how much of the exam would be devoted to each area. Now, if these first two phases are done well, and if they're done thoroughly, we can feel pretty good about putting together our rigorous high-stakes credentialing exams. Now, the emphasis here is on doing those first two phases well and thoroughly. So that brings me to the purpose of what we're looking into today and the question we wanted to address, which is what about underlying subgroups? So if you have underlying subgroups of practice types in your examining population, what kind of implications might that have on your blueprint development? So I'm going to go through a little fun example here. Now, this is all fake data. I made this up, so this is not based on any sort of data collection, just an example to sort of illustrate for you the concept that we are interested in looking into. So let's say you're trying to develop a blueprint for a certification exam in psychometrics. So you conduct a practice analysis study and perhaps you learn that there's 5 important topics. So again, I realize this is not an exhaustive list of psychometrics, but let's just say you land on these 5 important topics over in the left, and then based on some average responses you collect from your survey, you determine an allocation on an exam like what's shown in the right-hand column for those percentages. But maybe in reality, there's actually 2 different underlying subpopulations of how psychometricians are practicing in the field, but your data didn't show this because you just averaged all the responses together. So specifically, let's say you have this one underlying subgroup that's about 50% of your population. These people might be defined as spending their time kind of doing a little bit of everything. So sort of similar to the allocation you had at the top, but not exactly. And then maybe you have the other 50% of your population that has a bit more of a focus on, say, equating. So doesn't really look exactly like the other group. They mostly focus on equating, then IRT, not much of anything else. So you may still find it appropriate to take your original blueprint specs that came out of your practice analysis and just use those. You may still have an argument for that being a good representation of sort of an average certified psychometrician, but you could also say maybe it makes more sense to have 2 different tracks of being a certified psychometrician, one with a little bit of everything, one with a heavy IRT or heavy equating focus. Either way, the point and the reason for showing this is that it would be nice to know this type of thing up front before you're developing a blueprint if these types of populations actually exist. That way it doesn't come back to bite you later if you then develop an exam and it doesn't really accurately reflect your population. So again, just to elaborate, another example, again for fun. So here's those same specs at the top. Perhaps your 2 populations is one larger group and one smaller group. So maybe your larger group is, again, that more generalist type, a little bit of everything. And your smaller group, again, is maybe more of a focused equating group. Now, in this case, again, you might decide you could still go with that overall sort of allocation that applies to everyone. Here, the argument would be more like, well, 90% of the people sort of are closer to this, so you wouldn't want to necessarily cater to the other 10%, but still, that would be something to consider and a decision to make, and better to know this information up front than sort of have it come back and bite you later. So if underlying subgroups of practice exist, basically we wouldn't want to miss that. So we'd want to know that in the exam development phase. So that leads me to talking about the utility of person-centered approaches for analyzing data coming from practice analysis studies. So person-centered approaches look at sets of variables or multiple variables and try to find common configurations of people or common configurations of practice types. So in credentialing exams, you could think of this as answering the question, is there one general practice profile appropriate for describing what happens on the job for everyone in the population, or is there more than one type of practice profile? And if so, what would that mean for having one set of blueprint specs? Would that really be appropriate for all your examinees? So a couple of examples of person-centered approaches that I will be talking about are cluster analysis and mixture modeling, but of course there are others out there as well. And just to note that there's been some previous research looking at this as well. So specifically in 2018, Wise did a really nice study demonstrating a person-centered approach, looking at some practice analysis data with the task inventory method. He used mixture Roche models to study some data from a medical imaging credentialing examination. It's a really nice illustration of these types of techniques for answering this type of question. However, with mixture IRT models, sometimes you have some really large sample size requirements and strong assumptions that if they're met, they might not hold. So these types of methods might not always be feasible or accessible. which is why we wanted to explore and illustrate other types of person-centered approaches. So that's the purpose of this study, is just to illustrate a couple of other person-centered approaches and how they can be used to provide some useful information to answer this type of question. We find that we're hoping this is important because it expands a practitioner's statistical toolbox, just sort of letting practitioners know that this type of approach could be used to analyze data like this. But more importantly, it specifically tests that possibility of more than one underlying population. So moving on with our illustration, the data we used and full details of all this is in our paper. I'll be giving some sort of high-level information here. The data we used is responses from a survey question that was administered about physicians' practice characteristics. So the specific question was estimate the percentage of patient problems that you encounter across all work settings if applicable in each of the following areas. There were 13 variables or 13 different topics that were then analyzed. And our data set had a little over 11,000 people in it. So the first approach we wanted to demonstrate was cluster analysis. So remember, person-centered approaches, the purpose of them is to look for common configurations or common patterns of people. So within cluster analysis, we'll be referring to these as clusters. That's the terminology used. So we did a k-means cluster analysis performed, and we wanted to look at solutions from 1 cluster up to 20 clusters. And then the way you have to determine which solution you want to champion is by looking at a couple of different things. So we looked at within clusters, sums of squares, Scree Plot. That really helps you sort of land on the number of clusters you want to look at. And then you also really need to look at the interpretability of your clusters as well. So things like uniqueness. Are the clusters unique from one another? What are the sample sizes? Are they large enough to be meaningful? Things like that. So here's the Scree plot that we got from our analysis. So with the Scree plot, along the y-axis, you have the within group sums of squares plotted. Along the x-axis is the number of clusters. So you want this, what you'll see with this is as you extract more clusters, the within group sums of squares will go down because the whole point is to minimize within group sums of squares. But you're looking for a place where that sort of levels off and you're not really getting any more bang for your buck. So we kind of landed on solutions for 10 through 15 clusters to focus on. And at that point, we really dug into each of those solutions by examining them closely to see if there was redundancy among the clusters, if they were really distinct and substantively meaningful from one another. Ultimately, we ended up going with a 10 cluster solution as being the one that seemed best for our data. 6 of these 10 clusters would be worthy for further exploration as indicated by their size and their cluster meaningfulness. So we would recommend digging into 6 of these a little bit further as being, potentially representing underlying subpopulations. Now, the second approach that we looked at that I'd like to illustrate, again, full details of all of these are supplied in the paper along with more detailed results. But the second approach is latent profile analysis. So this is a type of mixture modeling that is appropriate for when you have a continuous variable or a set of continuous variables that you're trying to answer. So this is a model-based approach. So here you're specifying models in advance, then testing them and running them. So we ran 1 through 7 class models. Above that, we did try to test models above that, and there were some convergence and stability issues. So we stopped after 7. And with mixture modeling, since it's model-based, you have some more fit indices you can look at that can help you decide which solution to go with. You can also look at classification, and of course, as with all these, you want to look at the utility of the solution. So a bit more objective criteria available with the latent profile analysis. So let me just touch on each of these a little bit more. So with our data, we looked at 3 fit indices, the AIC, the BIC, and the sample size adjusted BIC. With all these smaller values would indicate you have a better fitting model. These pointed to our 6 class model being the one with the best fit. We also looked at a Low-Mendel-Rubin statistical significance test where you can compare a K-class model to a K+1 class model. And if you have significance, that indicates that your K+1 class model would not be necessary. You don't need that extra class. So this test pointed to the 5 class model being one that fit best. We also looked at classification. Our entropy statistics range from 0 to 1. 6-class and 5-class models both had sort of similarly very high entropy statistics here, so not much difference in that regard. Basically, looking at all this, we were sort of left with having to choose between the 5-class and 6-class solution. The 6-class, what we saw when we really dug into these parameters, looked at the solutions in a very detailed way, plotted some means, things like that. The 6-class that was extracted with that 6-class solution was substantively unique from the 5-class solution, and seemed like it could be meaningful for the field. Also, the 6-class solution had more of a spread in class size and proportions. Ultimately, for these reasons, we ended up going with our 6-class solution as one that would be fitting the data the best. So again, full details of those examples are in the paper, just some discussion and practical implications I'd like to point out. First, person-centered approaches here that I've demonstrated, these allow practitioners to really investigate the possibility of there being more than one common practice profile in the field. And if you were to find evidence of this, then you can think about what that means for your blueprint specifications and whether or not, down the road, there'd be consequences for maybe fitting one set of blueprint specs for everyone that sits for your exam. Now, a really important next step with both of these types of approaches and with person-centered approaches in general is to have subject matter experts weigh in on the meaningfulness of the classes or clusters that you're looking at. As psychometricians and statisticians, we know how to interpret the data, but really having that content expertise weigh in as well is essential with these types of methods, because you can always have spurious classes emerge from the technique. So you really want to make sure you're not over-interpreting the data without having some content expertise as well. Few other considerations to note here. When you're selecting a PC approach, say you're just trying to decide between cluster analysis or mixture modeling, sample size might play into this. Cluster analysis can handle smaller sample sizes, whereas mixture modeling cannot. Also, some convergence and stability issues might come into play if you're doing a mixture model. Like in our case, once we got to 7 classes and above, the solutions weren't stable. So if you're running a more complex model, you might run into some issues there. That might be a reason to pick a cluster analysis. Also with mixture modeling, though, one thing that's nice about that is you get those fit indices. So it's, I would say a little easier to kind of decide what solution you're going to go with. You have some more concrete fit indices there to help you with that. But of course, with both of these, important to remember that possibility of spurious classes that can emerge. So to always be planning on validity evidence with your content experts as a next step. So final recommendations, we think that being aware of these person-centered approaches as part of your practice analysis phase really can help strengthen your validity arguments. If you are having a really good understanding of your population at that phase, that can help make sure you're designing your blueprint accordingly. So we recommend collecting this type of validity evidence, and to make sure if you're seeing multiple clusters or classes that you are getting content expertise to weigh in as well before you take that too far down the road. And with these approaches, we always recommend, when possible, to replicate them with more than one sample when you can. So that wraps up my presentation. I will stop sharing and pass it off to the next presenter. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Pamela. I did not see any questions pop up in the chat, but if you do have a question for Pamela, feel free to put it in the chat, and I'm sure she'll address it there. So to keep everything on track, I'm going to continue with the next presentation, which is me. Feel free to put your questions in the chat, though. And like Pamela, I would like to acknowledge my co-author, my colleague Jerome Clauser. And our project is titled The Effective Item Writing Experience on Item Quality. So some background. Despite advances in the field of test development, generally, as I mentioned earlier, the actual process of producing test items is still somewhat mysterious. And there is quite a few prominent names in the test development literature who've done tremendously fabulous work in this area, but there's still a lot that is unknown. But there is one assumption that we sort of decided to take a closer look at, and that's the assumption that many test practitioners hold that with more item writing experience, we would observe items of better quality. In other words, if item writers gain more experience producing items, the quality of the items they produce should also increase accordingly. However, this assumption, although super logical, has not officially been tested empirically in the literature. Most of the literature in this area is focused on item writer training, which is fundamental, absolutely necessary, but not much has been done on experience. As far as training is concerned, all reports are in favor of more training is better compared to less training or no training whatsoever. Some other studies have focused on the frequency of committing item flaws when writing items, but not so much any statistical measures of item quality. And us as psychometricians or measurement experts, measurement professionals, we really want something more quantitative, something more about, you know, the parameters we look at when we think about item quality. And there have been, there's one study that used think alouds and retrospective reports to get at the item writing process and specifically the effect on the experience on item writing efficiency. How quickly, how effortlessly do item writers produce items as they gain more experience? And here, as you might suspect, they found that yes, item writers become more comfortable with the process. There is fewer item writer blocks or impulses, but they didn't really look at item quality per se. And much like the other studies in this area, the sample size was very small. In this case, it was only 3 item writers. So in summary, there is some tangential evidence on item writing experience, but sample sizes are small and the direct link between item writing experience and item quality has not been studied. So the purpose of our study was to examine this exact link between years of item writing experience and item quality across several disciplines and the medical field. And we operationalized item quality using 4 desirable statistical markers: item difficulty, item discrimination, pretest success rate, and mean number of compelling distractors. Now, item difficulty is not really an indicator of item quality per se, because you can have a very easy or a very difficult item that is just fine from a content perspective, maybe desirable to put on an exam, but we just were interested to look at difficulty for any systematic trends as item writers gain more experience. Item discrimination, arguably one of the best indicators of item quality. For this one, we use the biserial correlation, the item total biserial. Pretest success rate is just what proportion of the items you pretest meet your screening criteria. And finally, the mean number of compelling distractors. This is the number of distractors that attract at least 5% of examinees, which is a fairly low bar, but has been mentioned several times in the literature as an indicator, so that's what we used. We did 2 types of analyses to examine the link between experience and quality. And all of our analyses are based on over 5,000 pretest items written and administered over a 6-year period. And again, these are items in 6 different disciplines. Item authors were members of standing item writing committee members who had some initial training that is standardized across all item writers, all item authors, and an annual light dose of additional training just to sort of keep everyone on the same page and to sort of reinforce some of the basic principles of item writing. Years of item writing experience was the years since the author's first items. So for example, if an item author joined an item writing committee in 2015, any items that they produced in that first year would be associated with 0 years of item writing experience. Then the next year, the items in 2016 will have will be associated with a year, 1 year of experience. In 2017, that item author will have 2 years of experience, and so on. So we really looked at the items as they were produced over time by different authors and had an indicator for years of experience. And descriptive analyses were performed on all 4 indicators that I just mentioned of item quality in aggregate across disciplines. And then we did some additional analysis, which are more advanced. And that's what I show here on the next slide. So given that items can be considered nested within item authors, there is likely some shared variability among items that were developed by the same author. We utilized hierarchical linear modeling, where items were considered nested within authors, and we formally assessed the necessity and appropriateness of this modeling framework, looking at the interclass correlation coefficient, which ranged from 0.013 to 0.051 across disciplines, which is a pretty good size. It is not too low to where you can extract any between group variability, but it is not overly large either. We examined each discipline separately. One of the reasons for this was to avoid a 3-level model, which becomes quite complicated and computationally intensive. And we examined individual author growth trajectories over time. So this is one of the benefits of using this modeling framework, and allowed us to answer questions such as, are there differences in item quality across authors with no item writing experience? And does item quality change in the same way across authors over time? So these are very interesting questions that you can't easily answer in a simple analysis, but this modeling framework allows us to do so. And the outcome we used here, the dependent variable, is item discrimination. Again, the item total by serial correlation. And we specified an unconditional growth model, so no predictors other than time. And both intercepts and slopes were allowed to vary. So the intercept is the expected item discrimination with 0 years of item writing experience. And the slope, again, is, as you would interpolate in regression, the amount item discrimination changes over time for every 1 year of additional experience. And here are our results. On the y-axis in this graph, I'm showing item discrimination at pretest, and the x-axis is years of item writing experience. And these box plots give us a good visual representation of the distribution and clustering of item discrimination across years of item writing experience. The fact that the median in each box plot and the quartiles largely overlap indicates that item discrimination was fairly consistent across years of item writing experience. Same was true for item difficulty. As you can see, they look very much alike across years of item writing experience. And both of these indicate that with additional years of item writing experience, we're not observing any systematic differences in item difficulty or item discrimination. We also looked at years of item writing experience and pretest success rate. As you can see in this table, the pretest success rate is very stable across years of item writing experience, a little higher with 4 years of experience. But other than that, fairly stable. And you should note that the number of items decreases over time due to attrition, fewer items produced with more experience. So these are a little less stable as compared to the first few cells. And finally, the last descriptive analysis was on the mean number of compelling distractors. Here we broke down the analysis based on the number of response options, because this sort of drives the mean. When you have more options, the number of distractors can be larger. But as you can see, there's not systematic differences in the mean number of compelling distractors across years of item writing experience. So everything I've presented so far indicates, well, it appears as though additional years of item writing experience are not making a meaningful difference as far as the 4 indicators of item quality we considered. However, we did do some additional analysis, the more advanced analysis using HLM, and I'll be presenting sort of 2 graphs that summarize our findings using this modeling framework. Here I'm showing the dependent variable item discrimination on the y-axis over years of experience. However, here you're seeing many, many different lines, and each line in this graph is a single author. So what's depicted in the graph is the expected item discrimination for a given author over time. So if you look at the green line at the very bottom, the origin of that line on the y-axis, where the line meets the y-axis, is the intercept. This is the expected discrimination of items produced by this author when they have 0 years of item writing experience. And over a 5-year period, the expected change in item discrimination for this author is about 0.02. And they're actually decreasing. So ideally, we would want, item authors discrimination to increase with more experience. And that is true for some folks, but not for everyone, and some are indeed decreasing. One takeaway from this graph is in terms of typical things we evaluate in HLM or multi-level models is the spread of intercepts and variability in slopes. In this case, neither the origins or the intercepts of these lines vary significantly, nor do the slopes. What this means is that item authors did not differ in item discrimination of the items they produced when they started their terms of service with 0 years of experience, nor did they change significantly over time or from each other as they gained more experience. And this was true specifically for the significance of slopes, and the variability of slope was true for all 7 exams. So this was discipline A. In discipline B, the picture looks a little different. So we have the same sort of setup here. We're looking at the spread of the intercepts and the sort of the variability in slopes. In this case, we see a significant variability of intercepts, but no significant variability in slopes. This means that item authors do differ from each other significantly at the start of their service with 0 years of item writing experience, but they do not change significantly over time or from each other. In fact, they look like they're becoming more homogeneous, more similar to one another. So this is different from the previous graph. And this was the case, like discipline B, this was the case for 5 of the 7 disciplines. We saw significant variability in intercepts, but no significant variability in slopes, in how item discrimination changes as authors gain more experience. So in summary, we examined the relationship between item writing experience and item quality using item difficulty, item discrimination, pretest success rate, and mean number of compelling distractors as indicators of item quality, because this has not been formally done in the literature, and we think it is important to examine. We examined variability across item authors and disciplines in item discrimination at the start of item writer's service and over time. And our main finding was this: while there is no notable variability in the quality of items produced by authors at the start of their service in most disciplines, while there is notable variability in those intercepts, there is no significant change in item quality as item writers gain more experience in any discipline. So for most disciplines, there is variability when in discrimination when item authors start their service. So they come in with some differences and they show up after training. But as they gain more additional experience, we're not seeing any change. What are the implications of this main finding? Well, we have to talk about item writer performance and management. So as you are well aware, most likely, items are very expensive to develop. One estimate is at about $2,000 per item. And to sustain a healthy item pool, you need hundreds, if not thousands, of items. So given this recurring expense, it is a very good question to ask, are item writers becoming better at producing items as they gain more experience? Where our research shows not really. So we think feedback is very important, it is essential, and it should occur as early as possible. So in terms of item writer management, we recommend collecting a minimum of 1 year worth of data, of item writing data, item writer performance data, and then making a decision whether to retain a given item writer. Generally, we recommend retaining consistently good item writers, so they consistently produced items that met statistical criteria, screening criteria, that are decent discrimination, good range of difficulty, all those good things we like to see in good quality items. So if an item writer is consistently producing good items, retain them, and actually retain them for as long as possible. We didn't see anything in the literature that said, no, you need to let them loose after 5 or 10 years. So, and some organizations do retain item writers for long periods of time, and if they're good, keep them. On the other hand, we recommend to simply let go consistently poor item writers. This study, and which is pretty well rounded, I would argue, suggests that item writers do not improve with more years of experience. While training is very important initially, and recurrent refreshers of the training are encouraged, it doesn't appear that experience alone contributes to producing better items over time. So if somebody is not good and you have pretty good evidence over a year or longer that they're not so good, you're better off letting them go and replacing them with a new item writer you can train and rely on. So one limitation of the study is that item writers working in teams may still contribute important expertise in group discussions when items were revised or when there is discussion about content, even if they can't produce high quality items on their own. So in disciplines and in fields such as the medical field, where you have very bright a very bright population of examinees and very bright individuals who write test items, you may benefit from such collaboration and such discussions. So it is a little trickier how to implement the recommendations I just went over. But in conclusion, test development practitioners should monitor item writer performance on a regular basis, take action early to minimize waste of resources. And our general recommendation is, again, that poor item writers should be let go early and good item writers should be retained for as long as possible. Thank you. I see some questions or comments in the chat, so I'll go over those.
But okay, I think it's
go ahead.
A great study. I think it's really worthwhile to evaluate return on investment, evaluate our assumptions about training and longevity. And I half jokingly said you could do this study with psychometricians. I mean, maybe we don't get better with age. I like to think so, but maybe we don't, right? But no, I think it's a really good study. You know, we don't have enough studies like this. So I was really interested in your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen.
The term you need to know is fine wine.
Right.
Excellent. I cannot wait for Kurt's additional remarks after that. Feel free to ask a question in the chat, but we'll keep moving along. And I believe Kristen is up next. Or
yeah.
Yes. Okay.
I'm going to try to share my screen. This didn't work in the test run, so I'm a little, let's see how this goes. It says it failed to start again. So Bo, before I ask you to take over, I'm going to try it just one more time.
Sounds good.
There you go.
You're good.
Am I good? Great. So thank you, everyone. I was telling my colleagues before we started the session formally that I've been presenting at NCME for about 25 years, and I'm a bit nervous today because this is the first time I've ever presented someone else's work. I'm here presenting for Brian Patterson, who many of you know. He's no longer with Curriculum Associates. He left to start a new career at Facebook. Pretty exciting. And you know, I have a really soft spot in my heart for NCME, especially now that we're trying this virtual conference, and I really didn't want to withdraw the paper. So I'm going to do my best. Brian is a much more sophisticated statistician than I am, so the methodology that he used is not in my area of expertise. There is a paper that explains your questions about the models and the methodology in ways that I will not be able to do, but I still think I have something worth presenting, so I'll do my best. So the background is that this is a study to help inform assessment design for reading. These are passage-based item sets for students in grades 3 and 7 for an interim assessment that is used to inform specific instructional decisions. Just so we're all clear on terminology, when I say a passage-based item set, I mean I read a passage and I answer 4, 5, 6, 7 questions based on that passage. There's a strong literature base going back probably 30 years that indicates that a large percent of variance of item difficulty is explained by passage features, including passage or text complexity. I'm not going to review that literature here. There's a long history of it. If you're interested in this, I can send you some references or the paper. About 10 years ago, when the Common Core standards came out, or if that term is not legal in your state, college and career ready standards came out, there was a renewed focus on increasing text complexity in elementary, middle, and high school. Appendix A of the Common Core Standards, which is still available online if you just Google Appendix A, Common Core Standards, gives a really good summary of the research of the disconnect between the types of text that colleges were expecting freshmen to be able to grapple with, and frankly, the SAT and the ACT were expecting emergent college freshmen to be able to grapple with and comprehend, versus the text complexity that we were seeing used in instructional and curricular materials and state tests in the K through 12 world. So to bridge this disconnect, the Common Core really raised the bar in terms of our expectations of the complexity of text that students would grapple with in their classrooms and on their assessments. And this has rippled through all of the states. Another thing that happened when this renewed focus on text complexity emerged about 10 years ago or so, is that instead of just using quantitative measures, and at the time they were fairly simplistic, fairly normative based quantitative measures, there was a big push to use not only multiple quantitative measures, but more sophisticated quantitative measures of text complexity. Some of the products coming out of ETS and Pearson are just nothing short of brilliant in terms of how they are measuring text complexity by looking at a variety of text features, but also using qualitative judgment. So one of the practices that became common in state testing is to, or large-scale assessment of reading in K-12, is to have a couple of different measures of quantitative text complexity that you run your passage through, and then you apply a rubric that uses human judgment. you really look at those things together and you triangulate to figure out, this text is at the complexity that I expect for what I'm testing in this grade level. So that's the larger context in which we did this study. Let me see. Yeah, let me just talk a little bit about the qualitative rubrics. So I intentionally made this slide so you couldn't read it, because I'm not here to defend or debate or describe even what is in this rubric. This is a rubric that is used widely in the K-12 instructional and assessment field. This was comprised by CCSSO with lots of very sophisticated partners in the area of reading and text complexity. And this is the rubric that was used in this study. This rubric has 4 score points of low text complexity, middle low text complexity, middle high, and high text complexity. Okay, so when I'm talking about the judgmental rubric or the qualitative rubric in the remaining slides, I'm talking about this rubric, which again has been vetted and was developed with a lot of knowledge and sophistication. I do want to also share, in case there are any reading test design experts in the audience, I just want to assure you that at my organization, Curriculum Associates, and I think this is true of most places who develop large-scale assessments in reading, this text complexity rubric is just part of a much more sophisticated set of checklists and guidelines for either developing passages from scratch or reviewing existing passages. This slide is intentionally overburdened. These are just snapshots of a set of rubrics that we use at my organization when we are developing passages and reviewing passages and determining their quality and appropriateness for the assessment, including the features that are driving the complexity of the passage. So the rubric we used in this study was just one small component of a larger set of rubrics that we use in our passage development. So what did we do for this study? Well, we had 3 research questions that I'll review throughout the remaining presentation. First, and this is where I'm out of my area of expertise, we asked ourselves, does latent class signal detection modeling work with these kind of data? And by these kind of data, we mean human judgment ratings using that rubric about passages, okay? And does this methodology work? Does it tell us something interesting? Do we learn something from using this methodology? Second, what can we learn about the quality of not only the ratings, but the quality of the raters? So Bo, this is not unlike, you know, kind of what you were doing in your research. And then finally, and this is a really interesting area of research, what is the relationship between text complexity and item difficulty? This is an important concept, right, in test development, because if you're using an IRT-based model, right, and you want your items to line up on the scale in predictable ways that give the intended meaning to your scale interpretations. And we already know from 30 years of research that the #1 contributor to item difficulty is the complexity of the passage. Well, then you better know what you're doing when it comes to passage complexity, right? So these are great research questions. We could study these research questions for a long time, and I hope that we continue. But we have just scratched the surface today. One of the things that I wanted to mention is that this was a collaboration across assessment experts and instruction experts, right? So this is part of our mission at Curriculum Associates, where I work and where this work was done, is to make sure that we have coherence across the teams of folks who are developing our online reading lessons for personalized learning, the instruction and curricula experts who are developing our whole class curriculum, which is, when I say that, just think about a textbook, right? And then our assessment designers, right? We want to have them working from the same calibrated understanding of what does it mean to have a grade level text, and what does it mean to be working in 4th grade with a text that is, yes, it's 4th grade level, but it's lower complexity versus a 4th grade level text that is of higher complexity. We need to be calibrated on the assessment side of the house with the instruction side of the house. So what was really exciting about this is that we had 3 groups of raters, and we had one group of assessment experts, a second group of assessment experts, and then the third rater group was our partners in instruction. So keep that in mind when we look at the results. The data, we had a lot of data, so this was great. For grade 3, we had 57 passages. For grade 7, 36 passages. These were not quite evenly split, but a good balance between informational and literary. And as I described before, we had 3 different groups of raters. One limitation of the study that I'll go ahead and share now is that for lots of different reasons, we don't have multiple raters within group. We didn't do that type of hierarchical modeling. It is a limitation of the study, but what we do have is a single rating for each group. So for each passage, we had 3 ratings from the 3 groups I described before, 1 from each of the groups we described before. Each passage had, depending on grade level, 4 to 7 items. And then these last 2 bullets are just kind of a summary of the genres within each information and literary that we cover. These are the models that I can't even describe to you because this is not my area of expertise, but these are the models that were used to evaluate the 2 research questions about the raters, and then the model that was used to evaluate the relationship between text complexity and item difficulty. And these all fall under latent class analysis. So if there are people in the audience, and I think one of my co-presenters here, maybe one of them, who are experts in latent class analysis, you can email Brian Patterson if you have any questions about these models. But I can talk about the results. They're pretty clear. So this is table 1. This is a snapshot of table 1. And this is the model results. This is, again, not all of the results, but just a snapshot. And I'm going to draw your attention to the 3 data points in red. These are a discrimination index of sorts. And 1, 2, and 3 refer to the rater groups. Remember, groups 1 and 2 are assessment, and group 3 is instruction. And from what I understand from Brian, these are very good ratings, discrimination ratings for a reading or an ELA assessment. That you see these numbers almost double when the rubric is for something that is much more, that has a lot less judgment involved in it, like when you're looking at something in math or science. But for looking at passages where there's a lot of subjectivity, these are very good ratings. The way that we can think about this is that we can rank order them, right? So we can see that group 2, the second assessment group, they had the lowest rating, even though it was still really good. And then next came the third group, instruction, and then at the top is the other assessment group. The way to interpret this is that this is about, if I knew the true, if the passage had a true score, or a true, this is truly low or truly medium or truly high, how good am I as a rater at finding its true classification compared to a false classification? So the interpretation would be that rater 2 is 78 times, I don't know where the 78 comes from, 78 times is likely to correctly classify that passage than not, whereas the other 2 raters, because they have higher numbers, are 100 times more likely than not to correctly classify that passage. So the first research question, I think this is really interesting because it lets us know that, I know which assessment experts are in each of the 1 and 2 categories. And the second category, here's a reveal, these are our vendor, not our internal assessment design experts. So that kind of makes sense because they're not working shoulder to shoulder every day with our instruction and our assessment team. They kind of come in and out. So it makes sense to me that they would not be as calibrated with the group as other folks, but still very high and very good. The second research question tells us a bit about the raters themselves instead of the ratings. It's a different perspective on the same data. So for example, what you see here is you have rater 1, 2, and 3 across the bottom. The graph, and you can see the triangles and squares represent those discernments. I'm discerning between category 1 and 2 versus category 2 and 3 versus category 3 and 4, right? Because that's what you have to decide. There are those decision points, right? The dotted line, the dotted horizontal lines represent kind of the optimal cuts, if you will, that would maximize the reliability of the ratings. And so what you see here from this graph is that rater 1, that first group, they are almost right on with the optimal ratings. So they're just really knocking it out of the park. Rater 2, they are also kind of close to the optimal ratings, but what you can tell, because all of the symbols are shifted up, is that they're very stringent in their ratings. They're very stringent in their ratings. And what I mean by that is that it's very hard if you're a passage to have rater 2 mark you as medium, high, or high. And then the third set of ratings, what we can tell from them is that they're shy of using extreme ratings. Their ratings kind of all stick to the middle categories and very few 1s and 4s. So I think this is really interesting information as well. It could lend itself to a really good discussion among the 3 groups of raters that would help them get more calibrated on how they're interpreting the rubric and as they are applying it to various passages. And then the last research question was about the relationship between text and item difficulty. And so what you see here, category 1, 2, and 3, and oh, by the way, for these set of analyses, we're an assessment program. That rubric is that rubric that we're using, the CCSSO rubric that has 4 levels. That's really to cover all grade level passages. Within an assessment, it's because of time constraints and what have you, it's hard to include passages that rate as a 4 because you have to have really long passages to get that complex, which kind of is outside of our constraints. So for this analysis, we had to collapse those top 2 ratings in order to get convergence. And that was fine because we didn't have that many 4s to begin with. But what you see here is that for the 3 categories of ratings for this analysis, the distribution of item difficulty associated with passages with these ratings is pretty clear. And you can see that from these three distributions. And according to the results, about 78% of item difficulty is explained by a passage level effect, not text complexity, but just an overall passage level effect, which could have a lot of different things going on in there, right? But of that 78%, about 22% is explained by our text complexity rating. So I don't know if Steve Ferrara is in the audience. I know he loves this kind of research, but this is a pretty, it's not novel because we have a large research base that looks at the relationships between passages and items, but it is pretty impressive data. I'll wrap up with something I mentioned before, that I do think that the information from this model is helpful. I wonder, for the first 2 research questions, if a model like this might be overkill. I wonder if I could have drawn the same conclusions just by running some descriptive statistics. And I wonder if we could have found out more if we had more granular multi-level model with raters within groups instead of just a group. I do believe that we need more research on the relationship between text features and tasks, and there are people out there doing a lot of this kind of research, and I'm glad. I think we need to, and a lot of that research though is being done on grades 3 through 8 and college admissions tests, but I actually believe where it's really needed is in the early grades, when students are still learning to read instead of reading to learn. I think that's a game changer in terms of the characteristics of the passages. Also, if you haven't read the draft NAEP reading framework for 2025, it was out for public comment earlier this summer. There's a lot of really interesting information about the very contemporary views on the construct of reading, and I think there's a lot in there that we can learn from to design better studies. In short, what if I read the landscape of reading assessment and reading instruction, the focus is much more on overall comprehension rather than discrete skills like main idea or author's purpose. And it's on knowledge building and truly building knowledge through reading text. So as our construct evolves, our study designs need to evolve as well. Thank you. Let me check the chat before I close my screen.
Thank you, Kristen. I encourage you to ask your questions for Kristen in the chat as we are advancing in time, and I'll let Kristen stop sharing and Victoria to put up her slides next.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you, Bo, and thank you, Kristen. It's a great introduction to the next topic, actually. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for organizing this session. First, I think it's a very interesting collection of studies. My name is Victoria Yaneva, and I am a data scientist at the National Board of Medical Examiners. And today I'm presenting joint work with my colleagues Peter Baldwin and Janet Mee, as well as our collaborator from the University of Wolverhampton, Dr. Lian Ha. And before I present the study, I would like to mention that this paper recently got published and it's available and it's open access. I'll try to remember to post this link in the chat later in case anyone wanted to take a look. And now, without further ado, why do we set out to predict item survival? The reason could be summed up in the fact that item pretesting slots are a scarce commodity. So when we talk about the future of item development, such as automated item generation or technology-assisted item writing, we may find ourselves in a situation where we have a lot of items, but only a limited amount of pretest slots. And this begs the need to have an intermediate step between item writing and pretesting that would allow us to filter the items in such a way that we can match the pretesting slots to those items that are more likely to survive pretesting. As nice as this sounds, it is actually incredibly challenging because all we have at the time when we have just written our items and have not yet pretested them is the item text. So what we need to do is predict item survival through extracting features from the item text. And since this is a very preliminary study, I believe the first application of natural language processing to this task, what we really are interested here is the kind of predictors we are able to extract and whether they provide signal relevant to survival. And second, whether the different types of predictors provide different type of signal. In other words, when we combine them, do they complement each other or do they overlap each other? And the data we use in this study is approximately 6,000 multiple choice pretested items from the United States Medical Licensing Examination. And for the purpose of the study, we have balanced the classes of surviving and non-surviving items so that we have equal number of items in each class. The criteria for survival is based on proportion correct answers or p-value falling within the range of 0.3 to 0.95. And we also need to have positive correlation between the examinee's responses on the given item and their total test score or positive RB parameter. And now that we have described our purpose and data, we proceed to describing the extraction of predictors from item text. And these generally fall into three distinct categories: linguistic features, information retrieval features, and embeddings. I'm now going to introduce each of these categories briefly. For more details, please feel free to reach out or take a look at the paper. Okay, the first category is the linguistic category, and these features really refer to the linguistic complexity of the items. And I think here it is important to note that unlike in the previous presentation where we have passages with varying levels of reading difficulty, here we talk about items that were written in such a way that they only differ in the knowledge that they assess rather than the different levels of linguistic complexity. So here we have ranging types of linguistic features from basic levels such as lexical and syntactic, with examples such as average word length or number of prepositional phrases, sentence length, to higher order linguistic processing levels such as cognitively motivated features, telling us how concrete or abstract a word is, for example. And we have 113 of these features that refer to the linguistic characteristics of the item text. Moving on to the next category of features, we call them information retrieval features. A little bit of background about this is that in a completely separate project, we worked on training an automated question answering system applied to solving the USMLE questions. And make no mistake, we're still very far from solving the exam automatically. It's a very challenging task. However, we thought that we could use the performance of this system and how confident it is on whether or not it chose the correct answer as predictors for our surviving and non-surviving items. And the working hypothesis here is that there may be a positive correlation between the difficulty that machines experience when answering items and the difficulties that humans experience. We don't know if it is the case, but any signal from these types of predictors would be in favor of confirming this. Finally, our third type of predictors are word embeddings. This is something very commonly used in natural language processing in recent years, but I see not so much of it when we talk about NLP applications to assessment. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to go in depth, but I will explain the construct very, very briefly through the following example. Consider the sentence, we found a little hairy Wumpy mug sleeping behind the tree. When I use this example with audience that is in the same room as I am, I usually ask people, what do you think a Wumpy mug means? And the responses I normally get is some kind of small animal. This is really fascinating because Wampumut is a made-up word. It doesn't mean anything, but people are able to come up with shared understanding of meaning purely based on the context in which the word appears. And so the whole theory behind word embeddings is that we can represent individual words in the text through encoding their co-occurrences if we have large enough collections of texts. So with the new age of data and having a lot of electronic text available, this is readily available for training purposes. And this extraction of context information is achieved through artificial neural networks, which goes into that whole field of machine learning that is known as deep learning, and we're not going to discuss it here. But the reason we are excited about this is that each word then gets to be represented through a vector of numbers, which allow to perform mathematical operations with words. So if we took the vector of the word king minus the vector of the word man, and we added the vector of the word woman, we get something that is pretty close to the word queen. And this is very close to being able to have some imitation of understanding of semantics on the side of the computers. In our case, what we do is we map the words in our items to such vector representations that have been pre-trained using large collections of texts. And then we use mean pooling to derive a single item representation out of these many vectors. And without going into any detail, we use two types of embeddings called Word2Vec and Elmo. They're slightly different from each other in that Elmo captures a little bit more context. If you're interested in more details about the specific models, you can find out more in these two papers. And so we are now armed with our linguistic features, our information retrieval features, and our embeddings, and we are ready to test how good they are at predicting item survival. Spoiler alert, don't get too excited. The results are not amazing. But we were first faced with the choice whether to model the P and RB parameters individually, and then apply a function over their predicted values to find out how many false positives, false negatives, true positives, and true negatives we have. Or we could approach the task as simple binary classification where we try to predict surviving versus non-surviving items. We did both, and this is all described in the paper. However, we found that approaching the problem as a classification task leads to better results, so this is what I'm going to present now. binary classification between surviving and non-surviving items. Our first step was to assign the items to training, validation, and test sets, where we use 60% of the data for training, 20% for validation, and then the remaining 20% we have as a held out test set, where we evaluate any model that we have developed on this unseen data. Our second step was to use the training and validation sets to evaluate a number of classification algorithms, among which we found that the random forest algorithm provided best performance on the validation set. And this is an ensemble decision tree algorithm that is particularly good at coping with a large number of predictors, which may be collinear to one another, and solving that problem. And finally, our third step before training the full models was to compute our baselines against which we would mark the performance of the features. And before I comment on the specific baselines, I would like to mention that our metric is the F1 score classification accuracy metric. It ranges from 0 to 1, with 1 indicating perfect accuracy. And it is essentially the mean, the harmonic mean between precision and recall, or sensitivity and specificity. You may have heard these terms, but essentially it takes into account metrics of true positives, true negatives, false positives, and false negatives. So since we have balanced classes, our random assignment baseline is exactly 50% or 0.5. Then we tested what happens if we used item length as a predictor, just in case we had items that are longer tend to be more difficult, or vice versa. And you can see that this performance is around 0.51. And then we use our full set of linguistic features also as a baseline, performing at 0.54. The reason why we use the linguistic features as a baseline is because we are interested in understanding what the other types of predictors add on top of linguistic characteristics of the item. So basically surface features of the language that was used to describe the item. And the result is here. And as you can see, our best prediction is F-score of 55.8, which is highly statistically significant given the large sample size that we have compared to the baselines. But in terms of practical significance, we are still a long way from saying that we are able to predict item survival. The best prediction was achieved using the combination of all features, and we did test many different interim combination of features, which suggests that there is different kinds of signal that they bring. So when we talk about 55.8 F-score, or approximately 5 to 6% improvement, this actually means that we have 345 items that were correctly classified thanks to this method, compared to just random assignment. And when we think about how very few pretest slots we have performed, this may actually be a high gain, low risk strategy to predict item survival. The error analysis we conducted indicated that 40% of the false positives occurred due to failure to recognize negative RB values as non-surviving. Essentially, where the model fails tragically is to predict the RB component. It is like predicting noise. And this really is very challenging at this stage, because state-of-the-art NLP approaches are not yet able to do anything with that component. And items with higher p-values tend to be mistakenly classified as non-surviving. So that was also a peculiar observation. And to sum up, the strengths of this model is that it shows it is possible to extract features from text that contain signal relevant to predicting item survival, and that this is done beyond surface linguistic characteristics. And even though the different feature groups provide weak signal, this is a distinct type of signal for each feature group rather than an overlapping signal. So for future studies, it makes sense to pursue these different directions rather than just focusing on one. Of course, we must acknowledge that statistical significance does not mean practical significance, so we are a very long way from claiming we can predict item survival. And finally, our approach is very generic, so we have reasons to believe that it would generalize to items that follow the multiple choice format in other domains and other exams. So we are certainly very excited to try that. However, we acknowledge the caveat that these items may behave differently. Maybe they would have less text or involve mathematical operations, which is something that our model is not designed to cope with. But overall, we are excited to continue with this line of research, and we believe that any automated item generation efforts in the future would need some interim step like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. That was great, very interesting. And we are a little behind time, but we'll go ahead and then let Kurt share his feedback for us. Kurt, you have the floor.
Thank you. I think these were great papers. All four of them made me think, and that's after all what you want at a conference, whether it's virtual or in person. I think they were a bit more focused than one often finds in a symposium like this, and they were all focused specifically on important issues in test construction. Now, I'm going to walk through the papers as they were presented. First, with regard to Pam's paper on practice analysis, I want to start off by saying it's a great methodological paper. I encourage people to get it for that reason alone, if not for other reasons. Excuse me, it's the super work that we've all become used to getting from the American Board of Internal Medicine. And I happen to think that practice and job analyses are one of those topics that we don't necessarily hear about in ed measurement programs as much as some other programs. It's a hole in a lot of people's training, and this is a good paper. I also want to just have a very general comment for some people, especially graduate students, that certification is different from licensure. Licensure usually comes from the government, and it gives you permission to work in a field. Certification is something that usually comes from a professional association, and it is a statement that you've achieved some qualities, but it is sometimes used for job, like at the Mayo Clinic, they insist that everybody that they hire there is board certified. Now, the main question that I have about this is if you're giving very different tests or somewhat different tests to different groups within a certification, at what point does it need to be more than one certification? In other words, I would worry about hiring a board certified internal medicine doctor who really only knows about one set of things. I would be worried about a psychometrician who only knows equating, and if it just shows one certification and suddenly you're hiring them to do validity studies, they may or may not have the skills in question. So at some point you have to say, we're going to have to think this is two jobs now, or two certifications we're going to do, not just one. And I think that's really an interesting and important point. And it also relates to the fact that in lots of situations, including in medicine, there's a lot of job mobility right now. People move from a hospital setting to a private practice setting, although they're mostly moving from private practices to hospitals under Obamacare, frankly. And that's a good thing, really, but that's happening. So if you certify somebody with a generic certification and then they move from one job to another, maybe now they're not certified in the right way. And so you have to think about that. Let's see. There's a quote that relates to that in the paper on page 9. One blueprint may not be appropriate for the entire population. Well, that's fine, but maybe we do need different certifications then too. Let's see. The last comment I want to make is a really small one, and they used frequency as how often something happens as part of their practice analysis. And I've done dozens of practice analyses, mostly with civil service jobs. And what I prefer time spent over frequency. Now, they tend to be highly correlated, but the problem is, imagine someone who's a smoker and you had a question on a practice analysis, how often do you light a cigarette? Well, they may light a cigarette 60 times a day, but they only spend 2 minutes doing it the whole day. Whereas they might spend hours doing something else, but they only do it once a day. And so I think it's important to, and sometimes you ask both questions actually for that very reason. Now I will move off to the Baskoff and Clausen paper, another great paper. And there's always at every conference for NCME, there's an old guy like me who starts off a talk by saying, this is the art form of testing. This is the art side of testing, not the science side. Because frankly, writing items is mostly a creative enterprise, and it really is. And having done it, I actually spent 3 years in graduate school writing items 20 hours a week, which is one of my great skills as it turns out. But you have to understand something about learning theory. You have to understand about how concepts work and how concepts interact and how you solve problems by applying principles and things like that. And that's what most people, good item writers, write. And I actually recommend a book for many people by Kaplan of the famous Kaplan schools called Test Pilot that was written about the SAT, but he talked about how he diagnosed the kinds of questions he taught people to do well on the SAT. Now, the study they did is all, I assume, physicians who are working on panels because they're on a committee, and so they're doing this part-time. And this result may not generalize to those situations where you have full-time item writers. And that's a very different setting at a lot of the big testing companies. And I've served on some committees. I actually used to write items for a couple of different tests. And if you're only doing something once or twice a year, I'm not sure experience works the same way as it does if you're doing it every day. So I think that's important. I thought that they did have one finding he didn't mention, that some research shows, this is not a finding from their study, but it's in their literature review, that experienced item writers write more innovative questions, which I thought was an interesting point. I really liked their 4 measures, which came out also in the other 2 papers that we'll get to, difficulty, discrimination, pre-test success rate, and how many competitive options they have. Their plots of regression lines were great, and he walked through them well. I do think there's a couple of issues there. One which he mentioned, which is you find someone who's a good item writer and you keep them. Whatever it takes to keep them, you keep them. The other thing is I would follow them for the first 1 or 2 years, and if they're going up, I'd want to keep them too. And if they're going down, I'd want to try to get rid of them pretty quick unless they're really high to start with. So because there were clear lines that were going either up or down there. I also wonder if there are some nonlinear changes that take place. And in the sense that I think some people, it takes them a little time to get going, but then they also run out of steam. Either they're fatigued or they've asked all the questions they want to ask or something. And there's a last piece that I think is really important that I don't know any test company that really does this well. And that's probably a lack of my own knowledge, but what I would call tutoring. Now, I used to work with police and firefighters and sanitation workers, for God's sakes. And I met with them every week, and I would sit down with them with their items and give them feedback on what was working on their items and what doesn't. And most professional associations, what they're doing is they have people send these questions in, and they never get any feedback. And that's like the most fundamental principle of learning, is that without feedback, we don't learn very well. And so if you could actually give people feedback on how to write better soon after they've written the question, that would be a way to actually improve their item writing. Okay, moving on to the Patterson, but I'm going to call it the Huff paper. I'm glad she said it was over her head, this latent class signal detection theory. Although what I will tell you is, and this is how small the world is in testing, The guy who was Brian Patterson's doctoral advisor who does this work is a guy named Larry DiCarlo at Columbia University. And I hired him when I was chair at Fordham. So that's how small the world is. But
yeah,
having...
I didn't say it was over my head. I said it was not my area of expertise.
Okay, well, it was over my head anyhow. That's fine. You made me feel better. So take that as a compliment. Now, among the findings they had is that when you increase text complexity, you're doing it in large measure because of state standards. You're trying to match up to what states are trying to do. And I thought there were a number of really important findings here. One is they had raters effectively rate how difficult text is. And that's a useful thing to know. They sampled 93 passages from 4th to 7th grade. They rated the complexity on structure, language, knowledge, demands, and purpose or meaning. And then they grouped them into 3 categories. Now, I will tell you, I would like to know more qualitatively about those categories. Is one, for example, a low vocabulary, low knowledge demand category, and another one high? Or, you know, I'd like to have some real qualitative information. And you could get that from looking at where they line up on those variables. Let's see. And they found, as did the last paper, that the text complexity and item difficulty are highly correlated, or they're pretty highly correlated. I forget, was it 0.31 or something like that? I don't, that's from one of the 2 studies, it was 0.31, I think. Now, my sense about that is there's 2 ways to read that. One is if it's a really difficult passage to read, obviously that's going to impact how well people can answer questions about it. But the other thing is it may be that the item writers are writing more difficult questions about a text because it's more difficult. In other words, they're matching up the item difficulty to the reading, and that's why you have to know what's in the mind of the item writers to some extent. Talking to some might be useful. Let's see. And let's see. I think I've said almost everything. I will, I do want to be clear too that I don't think it's a causal finding. I think it's a correlational finding between text difficulty and item difficulty. And it's really hard when you think about it to think about whether it's causal or correlational. I went back and forth in my own head about that. And I have one editorial that I'll end with for this paper, which the informational papers are with, like in the social sciences, and then I forget, the literary ones are out of literature. I think it's also important to have some reading questions that are more almost vocational, like reading manuals and so forth, computer manuals, how to do manuals, because there's a lot of research that has come out of the Southern Regional Educational Board that shows that's actually keeping a lot of kids in high school and getting them to go to college because they don't like reading books, but they like learning how to do things. So they'll read a manual and stuff like that. So that's just a little editorial on my part.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Kurt.
Okay, yeah. Okay, then the last paper, which is very close to Kristen's paper, they modeled the difficulty of items and the point biserials or the biserials. I thought it was interesting. She makes the point that pretesting is expensive, but there's another issue that pretesting is also a security risk. And so you have to be aware of both of those factors. And that's one reason you want to have more information about items up front. I will say she had a huge data set with, I think it's a 5,918 multiple choice items. But she also used 113 linguistic factors, coupled that with information retrieval factors and with embedding factors, and did what amounts to, in my simple mind, a multiple regression. It's not what you did, but that explains it. And I really would like to see you cross-validate your results too on a independent sample, because you have so many predictors, you're going to predict well, and you combine, and it's not surprising that when you added all 3 together, it worked the best. So my sense is that's useful. You called your findings modest, but I think they're useful findings. It's very hard to predict point by serial. And I've had people who ran testing programs, who ran test construction programs, tell me, you can get people to write harder or easier questions. It's very hard to get them to write more differentiating questions. That's just a skill that's very rare. And for I want to say for both of you, both of the last two papers, there's a lot of research from the 50s at Columbia that showed people are really able to estimate the difficulty of items very, very well, at least the relative difficulty. So if you have some items, this is work that was done by Lorge and Krugman in 1953 and Sherman Tinkelman, and Bob Mislevy has done some work on it too, that show that you can rank order questions very well. So if you have some items that you know how difficult they are, you can really predict how difficult they're going to be at any rate. And I came up with a few questions to show you just simple memory questions can be really difficult, and problem-solving questions can be easy. So I looked at a list of presidents. Okay. Was Chester Arthur president before or after Grover Cleveland? Now, it's a simple memory question, but who knows the answer? I didn't, except in what year was Benjamin Harrison elected president? Who was Andrew Johnson's vice president? Now, that's an interesting one, because I never knew this before, but Andrew Johnson did not have a vice president for 4 years. So there's a none of the above question. And I actually had that as one of my statements for Bo Bashkoff's paper, is that there is, I mean, and I used to work with nurses in building nursing exams. There is a whole progression for how people learn to write questions. So they're reading through a book and they come to something that has 3 things. Well, then they write a question, which of the following is, and they throw in all of the above as the right answer. Or if they can't come up with a 4th option, they do none of the above. And you can train some of that out of people, but they still do it. And I think this is an art, but I think there are ways we can train people better. And I think you're doing great stuff to help us pick out which items are going to work. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kurt. Very thoughtful comments, and your experience really shines through those comments. So thank you so much for agreeing to be the discussant for this session. Thank you. Thank you to all the presenters. I know, glad you enjoyed them. Thank you to all who were able to join, and I'm sorry we're a little over time, but we hope you enjoyed this session. There was a link in the chat to fill out the survey. And thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your evening.